so I got around to playing the Avengers beta over the weekend through pre-ordering the game on PS4. I would just like to make a quick note before we start to say that this is a completely shit move. It's one thing to get exclusive content, which this game will already be providing for PS4 with Spider-Man, but to get exclusivity to a beta just feels petty and pointless. Betas are mainly used to test your game to make sure that things are running smoothly leading up to release. Having one platform have an exclusive right to it over others just feels counterintuitive, but I digress. When I first heard of Avengers, I was pretty excited. I'm a big fan of Marvel, and I have been a fan of Crystal Dynamics games so far with their Tomb Raider series, so I found it to be a good mix. That was because I originally assumed that it was going to be a single-player experience, as they were going into detail about their original story when the game was initially announced. But later on, realized that it was actually going to be a live service game. This instantly made me cautious, as for me, live service games tend to have a bad track record. They tend to have weak launches with minimal content or have content promised that don't end up living up to said promises. Both the Destiny games, The Division and Anthem can attribute to that. Now with the beta being released, I decided to give it a fair shake before judging the game to see if there was anything here that could lessen my worries. All I can say is, boy am I glad I played this before committing to a pre-order. Last year I ended up playing the beta for Anthem, as I was cautious about the game as well. While playing through it, the whole time I had this gut feeling that there was something off, that the game was hiding things that were not being highlighted in the beta, some underlying issue that wasn't being made present at the time. In the end, I decided not to pre-order the game, and it seemed I made the right decision. It's sad to say that I had the exact same feeling while playing through this beta. There's a few reasons for this. The one feeling that I couldn't shake off is that this doesn't feel like a passion project to me. When I look back at Spider-Man, you can see and feel the amount of passion that was poured into that game. It was noticeably clear that the people at Insomniac who were working on it cared about the Spider-Man property. Here, it feels more that Square Enix and Crystal Dynamics had the Avengers property thrust into their laps and they wanted to squeeze as much money from it as they could. What better way to do that than through a continuously updated and monetized service model? The main problem that I have with this beta is that it feels very style over substance. Sure, the game can look nice at points. Personally, it would have been nice if there was an option to turn off the motion blur, as it was sickening to turn every second, but there we go. The animation of the characters also looked pretty good. Hell, if you were watching the game, you could easily assume that the characters play uniquely. This is seriously not the case. Let's talk about the gameplay first, as I feel this is an important aspect for when looking into action games such as this one. To be blunt, it is the most basic form of combat I think I've played. Despite each character looking unique, their combat is anything just. Their combat is overall universal. It relies on mainly mashing or holding square and triangle, aerial attacks, range attacks, and grabs. These are usually seen as fundamental building blocks for action games, one for developers to further develop to diversify their combat and make it enjoyable. Instead, Crystal Dynamics took said building blocks and called it a day without adding any sort of spin on the formula. Imagine a game like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, without the ability to use combos or string together your attacks, and instead you just mash. Those games would not be received anywhere near as well as they have been because of their interesting and dynamic combat system. The only real uniqueness with these characters is in their abilities where they all have an L1, R1 and ult attack. Even then though, some of the abilities are relatively bland, with both Hulk and Miss Marvel's being outright damage buffs, Black Widow just having a more powerful stick to do more damage with, and Iron Man just turning into the Hulkbuster. I mean, I'm someone who plays and enjoys the Dynasty Warriors series, well known for how button mashy those games can be, yet I found that I got way more tired of this game quicker than I ever had with Dynasty Warriors. At the very least, that game had some form of string system where certain strings would result in different moves. It honestly surprised me with how basic the combat truly is. When they announced that there was only going to be 6 available characters at launch, I was perfectly okay with this. Games, especially fighting games, tend to benefit more from a smaller roster as it makes balancing a lot easier and the characters that are made available can have a lot more focus with differentiating their movesets. But that's really not the case at all, and I'm more disappointed than anything that the roster is so small considering how similar that they all play. It doesn't even make me excited for the new upcoming characters to be added to the game, as I feel they'll just end up being overly similar as well, with the only difference being their character models and their abilities potentially. The basic nature of the combat ties into the characters' individual skill trees. Now, in the live stream that Crystal Dynamics did for Avengers, it showed 3 different categories for the characters. In the beta, there is only one, which is the primary category. For me, this was a pretty big mistake. On the one hand, I get it. Since it's a beta, they can't show the full content, and since the level cap was 15, then not all skills should be made available. But the sense of individuality that Crystal Dynamics try to portray in their live stream where they say,
"Because it means your Thor will play differently than my Thor. and my Hulk will play different than yours.
Did not come across at all with the skill tree provided. It upgrades and plays out exactly the same throughout. The first two columns focus on the square and triangle moveset, while the other two columns would focus on range attacks and their abilities. The primary skill tree feels there wasn't a lot of thought or effort put into it, and certainly didn't feel like my characters was any more unique than someone else playing as that character. It's not completely terrible though, with some glimmer of individuality. For example, with Ms. Marvel, you can change her range attack into a grab and fling enemies about, which you can then further upgrade so that once you grab the enemy, you can crush them in your giant hand. Or hell, even Iron Man, where you can add to his arsenal, where you can add lasers and rockets. With Hulk and Black Widow though, there wasn't really a whole lot to comment on as they weren't as diverse. But the thing about lack of synergy, that can be attributed to how they've designed the characters' fighting styles. With Hulk and Ms. Marvel focusing on groups of enemies, while Iron Man and Black Widow fighting more one-on-one style, but it felt like, at least in co-op, that Ms. Marvel and Hulk end up doing much more in the fight than the other two, making it feel unbalanced. Now, when it comes down to action games, I find the two most important aspects is response time and frame rate, and this game seems to struggle with both aspects. With the combat, it was constantly feeling like there was a delay in the response, with after pressing the button there would just be at least a second delay before the character made any motion. This ended up making the combat feel clunky and unresponsive. The second aspect, the performance. I play this game on a PS4 Pro. Normally, so long as the game has the option, I will always select for it to prioritize performance over graphics quality. Yet even then, this game really struggled to even maintain 30 FPS at times. When it came to the somber moments like starting the mission or riding the many elevators, the game does hit that 60, but the very moment that you get into combat, that frame rate just dips. The worst is when you're fighting large groups of enemies and the frame rate will easily dip below 30 FPS, which is an embarrassment in all truth. The game would only then start picking up the more enemies you start to defeat. This just ended up making large engagements feel unenjoyable and frustrating. Another frustrating aspect is the camera angle. As of late, action games seem to have opted for this style of having the camera as close to the character as possible. In a way, I can kind of understand the thought behind it, making it so players feel close to the character or whatnot, but man does this suck for action games in general. I remember this being my main gripe with the God of War reboot, which I still loved, but the camera was the worst aspect. With it being so close means that enemies can easily get behind you and get a cheap hit purely because they're off screen. A game like this I feel would sorely benefit from the camera being much further away and giving the player more visibility of the surrounding, especially considering how many enemies you normally need to fight in one go. Well, putting all that all to one side, what about the game's ultimate objective? The loot. This is a looter game after all. So you achieve said loot through two different means, which is the story mode or the co-op. When it comes down to the story mode, the beta allowed about an hour's worth of content, with the first half being what was shown at E3. Here you'll get the one and only opportunity to play as all 6 characters that will be available on launch, as well as give you the setup for the whole story. The Avengers are having a day of celebration, until it is eventually sabotaged, with an unknown group attacking the area and it's up to the Avengers to stop them. This leads to a pretty linear level that does act as an interesting introduction to said characters, but what the level ends up feeling is in the similar vein as an on-rail shooter. A very linear corridor section that is just designed to be as actiony as possible through more visual than gameplay. You fight on the bridge as the multitude of characters until you get to the ship where you play as Cap America, and then we see the ship explode, with Cap reported dead, though let's be honest, he's more than likely not. This leads to showing the main crux of the story, being after the events of what is known as A-Day, a toxic chemical was released that led to a bunch of random people obtaining superpowers, including one of the playable characters, Kamala Khan or Ms. Marvel. An organization called AIM is then set up, used to denounce the Avengers and put the fear into people about superheroes and eventually get the Avengers to split up. They also used this opportunity to test on the newly superpowered civilians to attempt to find a cure. To be completely honest, this whole premise feels like it could have been more suited to an MMO, in the same vein as DC Universe Online. It would give a pretty solid explanation as to why all the players running around would have superpowers. But in this game, I have honestly no idea how this will really play into anything, as throughout the missions involved you don't fight any random characters with superpowers, just standard AIM grunts and mechs. Unless this would be a platform to artificially change some of the characters' origins to have this gas be the cause or whatnot, I guess we'll just have to wait and see how the full game explains it, but I'm finding it hard to see how the premise is relevant at all. In the second half of the campaign, you'll be following as both Hulk and Kamala as you go through yet another very linear level, except here the way the level plays out feels significantly different to the previous level on the bridge. While the bridge level felt more scripted and polished, this level felt more like the co-op missions themselves. Despite my criticism of the previous level, I did find myself enjoying that more than this one. It feels less like a campaign mission and more like I was just doing a standard co-op mission with some cutscenes sprinkled in. After proceeding through the level as the two characters, you are eventually greeted by an admittedly surprising boss fight, There's nothing really to add here without giving too much away, but the only thing to say is that it just felt very surface level. It's fine, it does the job. You'll then be introduced to the Chimera when it's revealed that this will be your main hub for the game. Overall, the brief glimpse we got in the campaign was fine. The only enjoyable character throughout it at the moment was Kamala. Granted, she's a pretty charismatic character in the comics anyways, and I feel it came off well for the short amount of time that she is having dialogue in this game. I think she's a good way of being this introductory vessel into the world of Avengers, and if there are people that are buying this game that don't really understand what's going on, I think Kamala is a fantastic choice to introduce said people to it. Overall, though, the campaign is more or less used as a glorified tutorial for the real meat of the game, which is the co-op. Now, this is where Crystal Dynamics is expecting you to spend the majority of your time in, especially if you finish the story. And the content that they had to offer was very lackluster, to say the least. This comes down to both level design and mission design. The level design in this game is uninspired. For the majority of missions, you will repeatedly be fighting inside narrow corridors and boring-looking server rooms. The only real instance of space was in the city level, the forest area, and snow area. However, the main issue with these is even though they're more open and expansive, majority of that space is filled with dead air. Sure, if you just beeline for the objective, then it won't be so bad, but if you're actively going around and exploring, you'll be finding yourself aimlessly running around more than you'll be fighting. However, despite these open levels, guess what? They'll eventually lead you to take an elevator and being put right back into yet another boring inside corridor section. The only exception was this one mission we had, which funnily enough ended up being one of my favourites, where it led to you going back outside and encountering a giant boss fight. I loved that moment and was disappointed that this was the only mission in the beta that provided such an experience. But as you can see, that's the main repetitiveness of it. It's do this objective, go down an elevator, do this objective, rinse and repeat until the mission's finished. Woohoo. And speaking of said missions, as well as the level design, it is also uninspired. They feel very reminiscent of Warframe with how similar a lot of the objectives end up playing out. You either destroy your objective, protect an objective, or kill a bunch of enemies. It's funny because as much as I love Warframe, as much as I've played it, the mission design is not really something that I would call as a major positive for that game. And hell, if they're going to just rip from Warframe a lot of its missions, at that point it's why would I really choose this game over something that is a lot more developed than Warframe? It just doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense to me. One mission in particular I despised, and it was a King of the Hill-esque mission where at least one player needs to stay inside the circle in order to garner points. Now on co-op this isn't too bad, as you can alternate with your friends on who's on point and who's on smashing duty basically. But when doing it solo, because the AI is so aggressive, they never play the objective, meaning you are just standing there aimlessly, mainly using your range attacks unless an enemy manages to sneak through, and you can occasionally use melee, but for the most part you're just standing there just waiting for the points to tick up. With the repetitiveness of both the level and mission designs, I can easily see this becoming very stale. There's a possibility that since we didn't have access to every mission in the game, that there would be some more variety in store for us, but from what at least was provided in the beta, it didn't look like they had much to offer. If anything, the main enjoyment I got from this game was when I was playing it with friends, which should be expected of a co-op game, but I find that to be a real shame. When you have a game that will be rich with Marvel characters, you expect the excitement coming from playing heroes that you grew to love. But instead, the combat just makes that difficult, so it just saps the enjoyment out of it. The co-op experience is just pure chaos. As I played with 3 other friends, we would just be going off and just smashing into enemies without any thought. Obviously, occasionally you'll have the objective where you have to just, stand there, or you have to destroy certain objectives, but for the most part you are just mowing down enemies as much as you can. I like to recall back about how Crystal Dynamics were stating in their live stream how they were designing the characters so there was a form of synergy with their abilities. But personally, I experienced none of that. It was perfectly viable for all of us to just go off and do our own thing. And the only type of synergy that I witnessed was when you're fighting the giant mechs where you can do a joint execution, but that's as far as it really went. I did also attempt both solo and matchmaking. Matchmaking I unfortunately couldn't really comment on, as of the time of recording, it just simply wasn't working. I would get someone join my game immediately, but no one else would join. But the game wouldn't let me start the match either, as it was saying someone was attempting to join. Yet even waiting 5 minutes, no one ended up joining. I tried this 2 times before I eventually just gave up on it altogether. So that just leaves the solo experience, and man, it's pretty dull. This game is definitely made with playing with friends or other players in mind, so word of warning if you are thinking of getting this game by yourself. As stated earlier when talking about the mission objectives, the AI is incredibly aggressive, meaning that the missions where you'll need to play the objective is solely on you to do, as your AI companions will just hard focus all of the enemies around you. So focused, in fact, that there was one occasion where I went down, and instead of picking me up, the AI just decided to start attacking all of the enemies around me and just left me to bleed out for the duration. The full goddamn 40 seconds. Although, in another instance, I was picked up almost immediately when I went down, so at the very least it seems pretty inconsistent. Quite an annoying issue I encountered as well was trying to get all the objectives in the map. As well as the main objective, you can explore the levels to find chests where you can gather resources or loot, as well as saving civilians. In order to save civilians, they are normally blocked off by a fragile door, and in order to get through that, you need to use a heavy attack. The only catch is that out of the 4 characters in the beta, only 2 of those characters can actually smash through those doors, which is Hulk and Miss Marvel. And since during one of the missions I was playing as Black Widow, that meant I was just completely blocked off from doing this. This means that if you wanted to go through a level collecting everything, you are forced to play as particular characters in order to get access to everything instead of playing just that one character you really want to play as. But as he said, regardless, there is one ultimate goal in this game, and that's the loot that I mentioned earlier. So how is the loot? You know, the very prominent aspect of this game that will surely be the very thing that encourages players to keep grinding its shit. To be completely blunt, it is shit. I know throughout this video I've said the word basic quite a fair bit, but it's the most apt criticism that I can muster. The loot in this game feels incredibly lazy and more of an afterthought in all honesty. The biggest sin for me is how the loot does not change the appearance of your character. In almost every looter game that I've played, one of the big things is upgrading your character's power level and seeing your character change as you progress. The whole idea of how at the beginning you look like a wet wipe, and by the end of it you look like some sort of god. It's a visual representation of your progress throughout the game, as well as giving you a sense of individuality. But all of that is stripped away, and in the end they're just stat checks. It will give you a base stat number, a bit of min-maxing opportunity with skills such as upping your melee damage, your range damage, health, armor, crit rate and damage, and there will be some effects like some stun damage or resistance to certain elements. But the loot essentially boils down to, does this loot item have a bigger number? Yes? Then slap it on. Ultimately, it really feels like almost playing Dungeons and Dragons, where you're leveling up your characters and you are just writing down on a stat sheet your upgraded levels, your upgrading attacks and whatnot. It just feels like there's no real effort towards it. I mean, sure, there's a system in place where you can level up the loot to make it more powerful, and that's really as complex as it truly goes. The bare bones nature of the loot really seems to boil down to how Crystal Dynamics plan on monetizing the game, which is mainly through cosmetics. This will be your only way to be able to change your appearance, but to be completely honest, the cosmetics weren't anything extraordinary, with most of them just being recolors. For example, Miss Marvel, where a lot of her costumes are just her wearing a shirt and then one of the hero symbols on it, and that is really it. I mean, sure, I would be lying if I said I didn't find like some of the costumes kind of interesting or kind of cool to see in the game that were ripped from the comics, but other than that, there really wasn't like a lot here for me to be very excited about. And for me, I completely blame this system for why the loot feels so stripped down and bare. But anyways, when it comes down to acquiring said cosmetics, there are 2 ways that you can go about it. Now, either you can go through the shop directly by purchasing them with in-game currency, which, as of the time of the beta, there is no clear-cut info on whether or not this currency is earnable in-game, or if it can only be purchased. We had a static amount of currency right from the get-go, and again, there was no way to earn that currency throughout the game, so hopefully there is a way of earning it, but there may be a possibility that this could just be paid for outright. And the other means is the one that is really getting me worried, which is the Battle Pass. Now, the Battle Passes in of itself, I don't necessarily mind. I mean, they're kind of a step up from loot boxes at the very least, so I guess there's that. But I mean, this is really taking it a step in a different direction, as it's a battle pass for each individual character. So that means that on launch, there is going to be a total of 6 battle passes on offer in order for people to level up. Now, the main thing that is worrying me, that others have pointed out as well, is that there's this nice little title underneath each picture which says free. As we know, normally how these work is that the top half provides the free stuff, while the bottom half of the battle pass is normally the premium items, so that if you pay for it, you get extra stuff with it. And conveniently, there is quite a significant amount of space at the bottom of the battle pass. This is looking like the beta has purposely left this out, ready to spring to us on release. And again, the big question is, will you need to pay for these individual characters, or will it just be bundled in one go? To add to this as well, the only way that you could level up your battle pass is through both daily and weekly challenges. Now, I don't play a lot of games with battle passes in it, but the last time I've seen something like this was the game Crucible, where it essentially time gates you on the progress you make on the battle pass. As once you've done either the daily or the weekly challenges, that will be done for either the day or for the week, meaning that you cannot earn any more XP on that battle pass until it is reset. Now, this seems in a way some form of time gating for a game that is a full price release. That kind of worries me right there, as normally when a game has to resort to time gating, normally means that they are not confident that they have enough content in their game to sustain a long playtime, compared to a actual game that would fill you with a lot of content that will provide you with long playtime, because you actively want to play the game because there's a lot to do. If a game has to resort to time gating, this could be a potential worry right here as to how much content will be on release. But, as I said, only time is going to tell how this will all play out, so it's something to keep an eye on when the game actually releases. The other worry I truly have with this game is the polish, as I ended up encountering a lot of bugs throughout my playtime. This ranged from both minor ones and pretty game-breaking ones. In terms of the minor ones, they were fine, they were kind of funny, such as the AI getting stuck to objects. Models would just randomly lose their animation and just T-pose and slide all over the place. For some reason, this seemed to be happening to Iron Man. I don't really know if it was my friend or if it's just the character itself, as there were other bugs involved with him, such as when he went down and we picked him up, but for the rest of the mission, his icon suddenly vanished, meaning we could really never find him, and if he ever went down, we couldn't tell because the revive symbol just wouldn't appear. And there was even a time where, during one of the fights we had, Hulk just went completely invisible, with the only thing showing was either the rubble he was holding or his hair. In terms of the game-breaking bugs, the most annoying one was when we had to do the defeat all enemies mission. There was simply a 50-50 chance the last enemy would just disappear entirely, leading us to having to restart the checkpoint to fight all over again. We would search everywhere around the level for this guy, and they would just be gone. They would just completely vanish, and there was nothing we can do but to reset. And there was even this one time where we reset one of the fights, and 2 of the enemies that we needed to defeat just stood perfectly still. Just stood there watching all their friends get beaten to death. And even when we just started fighting them, they simply just did not move. They just accepted their fate. There was also very prominent hard crashes with this game as well. I counted that a few times, and they did occur during the mission. I am hoping that Crystal Dynamics will be made aware of these bugs and issues, as I'm sure there are plenty more that other players will be encountering, and I hope that there will be enough time between now and launch for Crystal Dynamics to be able to find said bugs and to actually utilize it. I do feel like it's kind of a little late. It almost feels that, the release is almost right around the corner, but I don't know, maybe they may have time to do it. I hope they do. I hope these do get fixed. To add some little nitpicks towards the end of this as well. So for one, I really do not like the system of pressing up on the D-pad to look around for players. It's fine when it comes down to looking for objects, I can kind of understand that, but to just even find where players are, we have to constantly be pressing up on the D-pad. And the annoyance was as well that it wasn't even, a toggle. It was just, you had to press it once, but then it would just disappear. And that meant that you were constantly spamming up on the D-pad if you were trying to find friends. I just really feel that either all the characters should just have their symbols on them at all times, so it just makes it much easier to find people, or just have their names. I understand that it will be a little bit of extra clutter on the screen in terms of its UI, but I generally feel that it would just make things just a little less of a hassle. Or again, even just make it a toggle, make it so that when I press up on the D-pad, you can kind of make it almost like a detective vision mode from Batman, where you press up and you will have full vision of it until you press up again, and then you can just turn it off entirely. The other little thing that I would add to this game is a ping system. I feel that this game sorely lacked a form of way to communicate with other players to let them know if they're, if you're finding a chest or you're finding a secret place or whatnot. For me, it was fine. Again, I was playing with friends the whole time, so obviously communication was there and we were able to find the objects that we were looking for. However, if you are playing in a matchmaking setting, I can definitely see that being more of an issue. There's really no way to communicate to your teammates of what you're doing or what you found unless you're in game chat. And to be frank, majority of the time people are not normally in game chat, so I really think a ping system would definitely benefit this game in some shape or form. So to conclude this video, I'm going to be completely frank. It doesn't really matter what I or other game reviewers are going to say about this beta, as this game is going to sell extremely well. It's going to sell on brand alone. Usually you look at Battlefront 2, despite all of its backlash that it received prior to its release, it ended up selling really well because it was the Star Wars name slapped on it. The game ultimately does feel lazy and feels that it is pandering more to a casual audience. In a way, that's fine. I completely understand that. Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix know full well that casual audiences will be buying this game, even if they're people that don't even play games. They're going to see it's either Marvel or it's Avengers, and they're going to want to be buying this game just to test it out. But I feel that even as a casual game, this is just too stripped down. This is just too bare, and making this potentially really hard to enjoy or even invest the time into. I find that it's a game that I would really struggle to play repeatedly, especially after my 8 hours of gameplay. I just really honestly struggled to maintain any sort of enjoyment. It was making me bored so quick. And I can easily see this type of system just being an issue for that. Personally, I know I won't be pre-ordering this game, and I'll be waiting for the release to see how the game ends up panning out. For all I know, despite me being very critical and for me to say how I really distrust this game, there's a very big possibility I could be wrong, and this game could be released and it could be a fantastic game and it could be one of the best games of 2020. That is completely possible. But I do have a gut feeling on this, and I would seriously advise, especially with live service games, for people to be careful with them. Now, granted, if you're somebody who is fully ready to pre-order this game, who is fully committed to playing this game, or if you even enjoyed the beta and decided I really want to play this, nothing I'm really going to say is going to dissuade you, and that's perfectly fine. If this is a game you feel is going to be for you, more for you, that you're able to enjoy this game more than I have. But I would like to say that when it comes down to live service games, that it should definitely be something that people should be cautious of. There are too many repeated instances of these live service games and they're coming completely half-baked and unpolished, only with the promise of, don't worry, we'll fix it later, which is a pretty bad mentality for games to have, and I do hope it will eventually stop. I hope Avengers won't go in with that attitude of it having be a we'll fix it later type of mentality. I hope they are going to put as much effort and passion into this game. But for me, when it comes down to it being a live service game, it definitely doesn't help with my uncertainty, and I would advise people to not pre-order live service games and just wait. Most of the time when it comes down to these live service games, you tend to benefit more anyways when you buy these games much later on down the road than when you buy it outright. I mean, again, if I pick an example of Destiny, where most of the time when people are buying the Destiny franchise, they end up getting better deals with getting the bundles of the main game and the DLCs and expansions, and they get it for a fairer price than those that end up buying the game and buying the expansions later on. Now, granted, Crystal Dynamics have stated that all future expansions and all that will be free, and the money they're making will be purely through cosmetics, but still, it's definitely something I would look out for, and it's definitely something that I would not recommend doing, and to be as patient as you possibly can with these type of games. But anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.